Hi, welcome to Free Exchange. I'm Howard Wall, Director of the Hammond Institute here at Lindenwood University. And today we're happy to have as our guest Tim Jones, who is the current Speaker of the House in the state of Missouri, but not for long. In January, he'll be leaving that position and will, in fact, one of his new duties will be joining us at the Hammond Institute as a Senior Policy Advisor or Senior Policy Fellow.
Yes.
It's a new title, so
we're all getting used to it.
That's right. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Wall. Howard, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you all.
Now, since you've been heavily involved in Missouri politics for the last few years, well, first, can you tell us how long you've been in the House? Because you're still relatively young, at least from my perspective.
Well, thank you. I've been in the House actually 8 years. I've served an entire term. In Missouri, we have term limits, so an individual can serve 8 years in the House. You can also serve 8 years in the Senate. You just can't combine. You can't serve 16 years in one chamber or the other. You have to serve up to 8 years in the House, and then you can serve 8 years in the Senate. Some people mix it up and do it either way. I'm very lucky. I survived every single election, and I served a full 8 years in the House. And as you pointed out, I've decided to embark on a different career path now. But it's been a very interesting journey, to say the least.
Well, it's been a very interesting time period for Missouri and for the country in terms of policy. And also in Missouri, there's been, it's often talked of as a swing state and kind of a laboratory for what goes on in the rest of the country in terms of the politics. And we've had a Democratic governor for most of the time, or all of the time you were.
Six of the 8 years, yes.
Right. But still a strongly dominated Republican legislature.
Yes.
So you've had a lot of, I don't know if conflict is the right word, but a lot of give and take.
Tension.
We'll say, and tension.
Some healthy tension. You know, you're right. I have seen even 8 years has been a long time, but a short period of time all at the same time, if that makes any sense. Because people say in the legislature the days are long, but the years are short, and that's how it often feels. We've seen so many incredible changes in the electorate, not only in the state of Missouri, but in the nation. We've seen so many major policy changes and policy shifts, philosophy shifts. When I started 8 years ago, there was no Tea Party. Right. There was no major grassroots movement. We basically have President Obama to thank for that. After he first came into office, that very first year, 2009, when the plans for the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, were announced, that also launched the Tea Party movement. And then those folks became very involved, not only with national issues, but state government issues as well, which I didn't see in my first 2 years. And I think that's healthy. I think it's very healthy for our democracy, but it has been a huge change. You've seen more and more grassroots groups pop up that didn't exist when I first began. So in 8 years, a lot has occurred nationally, but also on the state level as well.
Now, statewide, things aren't quite as polarized, I imagine, as they are, as at least how they're talked about nationally. Is that an accurate
yes.
description?
That's a great question. I get asked that all the time. Is the polarization as evident on the state level? And it's not, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. Missouri is set up as a citizen legislature, so our citizen legislators many of us have other full-time jobs. We go back to reality every week, whereas the folks in D.C., they exist in that Beltway bubble, and a lot of them leave their homes, they travel great distances, and it's more difficult for them to go back home and I think stay in touch with the people. So in Missouri, we have a legislative session that begins every January, but it ends in mid-May. It begins Monday afternoons, it ends on Thursday afternoons. So our state representatives and our state senators are kept in touch with the electorate that chose them on a weekly basis. And then for half of the year, we're home in our districts, managing our small businesses, running our lives. And so I think that helps instill a spirit of cooperation and bipartisanship at times that you do not see much of anymore on the federal level. The days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, of Newt Gingrich and President Clinton seem to be long gone.
Yeah, and when you go back home and you might bump into colleagues or adversaries even, like out at a soccer game or something with your kids.
Yes, we see each other at events. We see each other at at legislative events, we see each other at social events. And so we learn about each other's families. We see each other in our natural environments back home. So there is a very, very different dynamic between a state legislator and a congressman or U.S. senator.
Right. No, in fact, I was at an event where John Hammond was actually receiving an award, and you were present at that. And I think you
Yes.
gave a little talk, introduced John, but also Governor Nixon gave a talk.
Yes.
So that was all in the same event.
It's very strange when you see all these people you hear about on the news or hear on the radio, and then they're all there live together. You know, it's like, and we got out of that, and nobody engaged in any fisticuffs. So.
No, it seemed quite peaceful.
It was.
Actually. Yeah.
Yes.
And Governor Nixon has been known as as a moderate Democrat, although that changes over time, of course.
It has. He definitely governed in his first term as very much a conservative Democrat, sort of in the mold of Harry Truman, traditional, values-driven Missouri Democrat, which was what Harry Truman was. Very strong on issues of defense and the military and the homeland, but yet, you know, a little bit more on the social justice issues with the working man and the poor and things like that. And that was fine. That was kind of how the old Democratic Party was. I think the modern day Democrat Party has been largely consumed by the far left. So after Governor Nixon was elected to his second term, you saw him begin to pivot back towards that left-wing base. And I think people, even liberal commentators, conservative commentators, they all agree with this. There have been some very well-known editorialists here in our state who are definitely on the other side of the aisle from me who have written about J. Nixon 2.0 in moving back towards the left, because some thought he had national aspirations up until this summer.
Right, and remind me what happened this summer. I believe it was in North County, Ferguson.
Yeah, a little municipality that pretty much the world has heard about now, the city of Ferguson. And the governor had an opportunity to show some true leadership there. He has been roundly criticized by people on all sides of the political spectrum as absolutely failing in that first round of conflict that erupted. Now, we're all hoping that he has his act together a lot better now, because any day now we expect the grand jury that's sitting in St. Louis County to come up with a decision on whether or not the officer in that case, Darren Wilson, will be indicted or not for any charge whatsoever.
Right.
So there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of peaceful protesters assembling and preparing for that. I think there's also a lot of outside agitators, groups that we saw during the first round, sort of trying to stoke the flames and try to continue their 15 minutes of fame. So I think the governor is going to have his hands full over the next few weeks and months, and I do hope he's better prepared this time around.
Well, I guess to be fair to him a bit, it certainly took me by surprise, sort of how it took off. Although maybe the governor's job is to not be caught by surprise.
Right.
But yes, that will be interesting to see. Now, since you've been in office, the Republican majority has really expanded a great deal, and I believe it's now at a record majority.
It is. It is at a record supermajority currently. So when I first entered the legislature in 2007, January of 2007, there were approximately, I believe, 90 or 92 Republicans. And fast forward 8 years, we're at 118 now out of 163 representatives. So we have well beyond a supermajority. So there's 118 Republicans, and
so a supermajority is what's needed to override a veto.
That's correct.
Governor's
That's correct.
veto, right?
The magic number is 109. We are 9 votes over a supermajority. So there's a lot of breathing room there now. And yes, that number is important because after the regular legislative session is over, the governor then has the opportunity to pick up his pen and he can either veto or sign legislation. The legislature then comes back for round 2 in September, and they can decide whether they want to override the governor's vetoes or not. Interestingly enough, Howard, the last couple of years we've had record-breaking veto sessions, and I think on nearly all of the bills, except for maybe a couple, it required us to also have Democrats join us. So the overrides were bipartisan. Governor Nixon's had a tough time just in general dealing with anyone in the General Assembly, regardless of party.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, so What do you attribute this kind of wave? Is it geographically there's more Republicans picking up? Because certainly awful lot of the seats are rural seats in Missouri that are Republican,
Yes.
and in St. Charles in particular. Is there like a geographic spread of the Republican success?
So it started off with the rural areas changing first from traditional Democrat districts to Republicans. But let's look at, the facts, and I know you deal with a lot of facts and figures. If you look at population growth over the last 10 to 20 years in Missouri, it hasn't been that dramatic. It's been flat to maybe up a few percentage points. So it's not like a bunch of new Missourians suddenly showed up here and moved the dial to the conservative side of the aisle. What you had happen was what I referenced earlier. The traditional Missouri Democrat Party no longer truly exists. The party of Truman does not exist.
Oh, so you're saying the party is kind of moved, not the people.
Correct. And some would say that, well, the Republicans have also become more conservative. Yes and no. I think the Republican Party still has a very large tent, despite what you might read on the editorial pages. I think we have a very inclusive party, and you're seeing more and more diversity in our party every year. This year was a record-breaking election for minorities and women entering the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, the Missouri House, of all different levels all over the country. And so I think what you've seen is the traditional conservative with a small c, Missouri voter, who may have called themselves a Democrat in the old days, saw the current Democrat Party being subsumed by the left and very liberalized. And those voters have decided, that party doesn't represent me anymore. So they switch, they start pulling the Republican ballot. So you started seeing that shift in the rural areas, but it's even now bled well into the suburban areas and even some urban districts. We've picked up seats everywhere across the state. St. Louis County, Jackson County, Boone County now. I just saw this article this morning. Boone County has more Republican legislators on the statewide level than it has in nearly 50 years. So I think it's the party change. It's also a mood in the electorate of, the era of big government needs to come to an end, and the people definitely want to have government be efficient but smaller.
All right, thanks, Tim. And we're going to take a break now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the different legislative policies that have been enacted during Speaker Jones's terms.
Hey everybody! Heart disease affects 1 in every 3 women in America, but you can fight back. There's no time to lose. Mothers, sisters, daughters, families, and friends, it's time to shout louder, stand stronger, and demand change. Let's go!
To the Batmobile. Dang it.
To the invisible jet!
Dang it.
Together, we can put an end to heart disease. It's time to go red for women. I could use your help. Yeah! Learn more from the American Heart Association at www.goredforwomen.org.
Lindenwood University. It's where you can get an education steeped in 187 years of tradition, but in tune with the needs of students of today. Lindenwood is where the liberal arts thrive. It's where young people and working adults can prepare for the next great step in their lives. Lindenwood has more than 120 degree programs from which to choose, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and a doctoral degree in education. Lindenwood has tradition, a sprawling modern campus, a supportive faculty known for its one-on-one attention, and personal financial aid assistance to help new students and parents feel comfortable with their college choice. Lindenwood offers the best of the St. Louis region, with a college town experience in St. Charles, Missouri. Find out why thousands are choosing Lindenwood University. Find out today. You can reach us online at www.lindenwood.edu or call 636-949-4949.
You wanted to be a teacher when you were little, but things changed. Teaching didn't seem that cool anymore, so you decided to become something else. But what would your 12-year-old self say? Amazing things are happening in teaching, so it's time to put it back on your list. Don't try to convince yourself otherwise. You had it right the first time.
Hi, welcome back to Free Exchange. I'm Howard Wall, the director of the Hammond Institute, and we're continuing our talk with Tim Jones, the outgoing Missouri Speaker of the House in Missouri. And I'd like to ask you, Tim, about like the most important economic policy changes in Missouri, because there have been some changes, and I know there's some tension between directions that Governor Nixon has wanted to go, particularly with taxes, and then the direction that the Republican-run legislature has wanted to go. And can you give me a little bit of background on what's been happening on that front?
Absolutely. So I would say when I first entered the legislature back in 2007, the major economic development models that were being pursued were in the area of tax credit programs. And, you know, just like any well-meaning good government program, the tax credit programs suddenly became they began to grow, I think, out of proportion with what was needed. And they began to just flood the legislative agenda. Every year, there was a new proposal for the best new, greatest thing in the tax credit world. And that was the marquee thing every year. Fast forward now to where we are now, and people began realizing that 65 tax credit programs on the books were a few too many. And we were starting to pick winners and losers, not just amongst industries, but amongst certain specific companies even. Mm-hmm. And it was too much centralized planning, which is not what Republicans or conservatives ultimately want to stand for. And so over the last 2 years, we focused on broad-based tax relief. We realized that our tax code had not been reformed to any great extent for nearly 100 years. We hadn't had a tax cut in 94 years in Missouri.
Now, I believe the tax brackets on the income taxes were the original brackets from the
That's
30s.
Right. 1934.
So the highest tax bracket was something like $9,000 or something along those lines?
That's right. And that's something that, you know, people always say, well, what are you going to do next? You've done everything you possibly could with taxes. No, we haven't. There's a lot more reforms that need to be had. You've identified one of them. Those brackets, even though we've got a tax cut in place now, we have not completely tackled the bracket issue. It was adjusted a little bit in the tax cut, starting indexing them to inflation, but they had not been adjusted in any meaningful way since 1934. So in Missouri, if you made more than $9,000, you were automatically taxed at the highest rate.
It's effectively a flat tax.
It is. It's a flat tax of 6%.
Yeah.
Which, when you combine that with federal taxes, other state and local taxes, taxes that your city or your county may apply, sales taxes. You know, Missourians, people say we had a low rate. We did not. You have to look at it. You can't just look at one tax in a vacuum. When you look at our overall tax burden, Missouri, unfortunately, did rank in the top third in the country. So that's not where we want to be. So the income tax cut, which was modest, I wanted to do a lot more, but you have to start somewhere, and you have to pass something, especially when you have a governor working against you every day, like Jay Nixon did. And he used the education system very cleverly, I think very unfairly, but very cleverly to push back on us, saying that education would lose money if we had a tax cut, which just simply isn't true, and it's not what the facts bear out. But we finally did pass a tax cut. Took us 2 tries and took us overriding the governor's veto as well.
Now, you mentioned there's I don't know if it's a philosophical difference in how to use the tax code. And I've done some research on tax credits. You talked about tax credits, and all research done by certainly academic economists, independent economists, show that these are really bad ideas in terms of economic development. They tend to even lose employment because they distort the choices. Even if you give them out without any unfairness or targeting certain firms, just the fact that one firm gets it means other firms are not, and they're disadvantaged, and you end up distorting the economy so much that you can lose employment. Now, but Missouri is, I believe, one of the leading states, if we want to call it leading states, in these tax credits. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's nearing $1 billion in outstanding tax credits, which is, Missouri's not a huge state, so that's a lot of money. And part of it is that you're kind of crippling the tax code because you have to raise, to collect the same revenue, you have to tax everybody else more if you're giving away all of this other money. And I think that's the part that's not really captured, that you're just distorting everything and putting the money in the hands of not business people who are deciding on what to invest in, but no offense, politicians.
I've been called worse. No, right. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of room. Let me put it this way: there's a lot of room for reform in our tax credit system. And all of the tax credit programs, I think, were well-meaning, had some very noble purposes. But like I said, every government program, you give it enough time and money, and it will go bad.
Well, some of them have some very well-meaning names attached to them.
Yes.
Historic tax credits, it's low-income housing tax credits, even, I believe, senior homes get under tax credits, but that those programs have been hijacked for economic development rather than trying to subsidize particular uses.
Trying to do a public-private partnership with because we've seen how well the government does senior housing, but when it left to its own devices. So when we have 65 tax credit programs with, as you mentioned, I believe your numbers are accurate, nearing $1 billion, there's a lot of room for reform there. And we did pass a reform bill the last 2 years out of the House. Unfortunately, there were a couple of state senators who sort of wanted to reinvent and reform the entire system all at once, and they wanted their imprimatur put on that. Well, that hung it up in the Senate, and it died. And the bill that the House sent over would have been an elimination of 20 to 30 tax credit programs with an annual savings of over $125 million. So that
part of it was actually, I believe the governor supported, because he put together a panel to at least streamline the programs.
Yes.
And to get rid of some that had a bit too much discretion, I think.
Correct. You're right. This is one area of debate that doesn't really break down on clean ideological lines. It's more of role of government in general. And so there are people who want to eat the entire cake all at once. There's people who are saying, this system has built up over the last 20 years. You're not going to undo the entire thing in one legislative bill. So I thought the House's position, being a House member, though, of course, as well, but I thought it was the reasonable way to start tackling the problem. And like I said, there were one or two senators who simply wanted more. And what people need to understand is in our state Senate, because our state senators have the filibuster power, like in the U.S. Senate, one or two state senators can completely derail a proposal if they would like to. And that's what happened. Now, do I think this will be back again? Yes, it will. This will continue to be a very hot topic. Falls under the overall umbrella of, crony capitalism and whether that's good for an economy or not. And so, I think this debate will continue. You're going to see some tax credit reform, my prediction, in the next legislative session.
Okay, well, that's good to hear, because I've even argued that there are roles for tax credits, and even some of the ones that have good names attached to them. Historic tax credits, if you're using them to actually restore or preserve historical.
To save an area of, yes.
For instance, I'm not sure which program this was under, but I believe it was the historic tax credits. Washington Avenue in downtown St. Louis was really about creating infrastructure and saving an area, and then there were some other subsidies that went with it, but then it was kind of allowing these external effects, and then you get some agglomeration, things kind of gather together.
Yes.
And that seemed like, at least, if not perfect, at least the direction of the proper role, but to use it to blight a perfectly good mall in a well-off area.
Right. You have there's eminent domain and TIFs and tax credits for proper purposes, and then there's abuse, and we've seen that really become a problem. And that's where folks on my side of the political spectrum, there definitely is a debate within the Republican Party, within the conservative wing, as to there's a big division, and in the Democrat Party as well. And that's why I say this really doesn't break down on ideological lines. There's people who want good government, and it all comes down to, are you really creating net new jobs and opportunities for your state and region, or, like you mentioned earlier, are you just moving the deck chairs around on the ship? So
right. Yeah, and it's remarkable, because I face this all the time, because I say that I'm a free market economist, and that's a very different thing than being pro-business. Mm-hmm. I'm not anti-business, I'm not anti anything in particular, it's just the market has a role to decide these things. So free market and pro-business is kind of, I think, the divide that you often see in the Republican Party.
Yes.
And then somewhat in the Democratic Party also.
Right.
Where that distinction is often lost.
People want a level playing field, I think, ultimately. And And yes, we want to preserve historic landmarks in our state, and some of those credit programs have been utilized to do that. But you want to make sure there's no abuse, and you want to make sure there's no problem in my mind with looking at these programs every so often, having legislative oversight, and dialing them back to what their original purpose and intent was. And the fact that we have 65 tax credit programs means that we were too free and just naming one for whatever new fancy thing came down the line.
Well, and I believe the largest effect from the reform efforts of trimming it back was the creation of a new and bigger program, the Missouri Quality Jobs Program, without cutting any of the other ones. So like with most government reforms, it seems like you end up adding more things instead of subtracting.
Right. There's a lot more work that has to be done in that area. And I think, like I said, I think this debate does not end with the end of the legislative year. It will definitely be back in January of 2015.
Well, and it's something that's in all local governments also are dealing with, because it's become like it's required or expected that if you're starting a business that you're going to get a TIF. Or if you're a well-connected business or you can afford to lobby to get TIFs, then you'll get TIFs, these tax increment financing or tax credits of some sort. So it's just part of the calculations that a business makes. Oh, and of course I'll get some handout, and then you hold up the specter of lost jobs unless the local government gives you the handout. And that actually comes from from schools.
Yes, and then you get into the issue of the broader issue of regionalism, and whether communities are only worried about what's in their backyard to whether or not it benefits the region or the state as a whole. And so that's what I mean about these net new jobs or net new opportunities. We did pass a bill this year to try to end the economic border war between Kansas and Missouri on the western side. We don't see that over here as much on our eastern side because, the state of Illinois makes us look better and better every day.
Oh yeah, we're looking great.
But on the western side of the state, you have two competitive economic models there, the state of Missouri on the western side and the state of Kansas, who has been very aggressive in job creation in Johnson County, Kansas. And we saw these tax credit programs really being utilized to our detriment, so we passed a ceasefire on the economic border war over there.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for joining us, Tim, and we're actually going to have another episode with Mr. Jones, and look for that one also. This has been Free Exchange, and I've been, and I still am, Howard Wall, Director of the Hammond Institute, and if you want to see us on the website, just Google it already. I'm sure you know how to do that. Thanks.